There are directors who tell stories, and there are those who expose the ones you buried. You didn't come to Tarantino for entertainment. Not really. You came for recognition, for the chaos that finally speaks your dialect, for the blood that feels less like violence and more like memory. You came because something in you, raw, bruised, unresolved, saw its reflection in a world where no one apologizes for being fragmented. You weren't looking for heroes. You were looking for witnesses. Because therapy sometimes feels like someone trying to reorganize your ruins without ever asking how the house burned down. Behavioral advice, calming tones, rational frameworks for irrational wounds. But Tarantino doesn't want to fix you. He wants you to see the monster you've been negotiating with in silence and not look away. Carl Jung once said, "The cinema satisfies the natural craving for myth." He meant that film speaks to something older than words, older than the ego. It speaks in symbols, archetypes, shadows. That's why when you watch a Tarantino scene, drenched in absurdity, fury, humor, blood, something inside of you exhales, not because it's healing, but because it's finally been named. We've mistaken healing for softness, for being functional, for being acceptable. But what if your pain doesn't want to be soothed? What if it wants to be witnessed in its true form, mythic, brutal, sacred? What if fiction is the only place where you're allowed to feel without shame? There's a violence in you, not the kind that destroys others, the kind that screams in silence every time you pretend you're fine. That wants to destroy the lie you've been told, that peace comes from denial. It doesn't. It comes from being honest enough to bleed in the open. Nietzsche warned us, he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. But what he didn't say is, what if you've already become one? Not out of evil, but out of survival, out of silence, out of needing a language that didn't sound like therapy worksheets and polite detachment, because some of us don't want peace, not yet. Some of us want truth first. What if the stories you watch are just confessions you've never said out loud? What if the most violent scenes are actually the most honest mirrors? What if the fiction you binge is the only place where your soul dares to exist without apology? And what if that's not wrong? What if that's the beginning? You were never drawn to the ones who had it all together, the ones who knew exactly what to do, who spoke with moral clarity, who won with grace. You watched them maybe, but they didn't stay with you. The ones who stayed were the ones who bled, the broken, the furious, the ones who laughed mid-collapse and never asked for redemption, the anti-heroes. Because deep down, you didn't want to be saved, you wanted to be recognized. And there is a kind of recognition that only chaos can offer. You saw yourself in their silence, in their mess, in the violence that wasn't about cruelty, but about finally being louder than the pain. Jung called it the shadow, the side of you that you learned to hide, not because it was evil, but because it was unacceptable. Your rage, your envy, your hunger, your sadness that refused to smile. These parts of you weren't erased, they were just buried. And cinema became the graveyard where they whispered back. You watch a man burn the world in a Tarantino film, and you don't recoil. You lean in, not because you're cruel, but because you know that feeling, that quiet, unspoken longing to finally let something erupt. To be allowed to feel as much as you do, without explanation, without shame. You weren't rooting for revenge. You were hoping someone would finally scream the pain you never did. That's why you connected with the ones who snapped. Because you've come close, because there are parts of you that have already snapped, just in silence, in insomnia, in procrastination, in addictions you don't even enjoy anymore. These characters, they're not fantasies. They're symbols, mythic embodiments of everything you never got to be, because you were too busy being acceptable, too busy surviving, and maybe, just maybe, you weren't supposed to be the hero of the story. Maybe you were meant to be the one who knew the darkness and lived anyway. not as a lesson, not as a warning, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, there's blood, but there's also truth. There's a difference between being broken and being distorted by the world's expectations. But too often, we confuse the two. You sat in a room, you talked, you waited for the formula, the explanation, the clean map that would tell you how to stop feeling like this, how to be functional, as if your chaos were a glitch instead of a language. But what if your rage isn't a symptom? What if it's grammar? What if that self-sabotage that keeps pulling you back isn't resistance, but protest? A part of you that refuses to cooperate with the performance. That sabotage is not because it hates you, but because it knows something deeper, that healing built on self-denial isn't healing. It's erasure. You weren't born to be normalized. You were born to be understood. Tarantino never asks you to be functional. He doesn't polish the pain. He lets it speak, howl, laugh, kill, collapse. He gives form to what therapy sometimes tries to compress, because not everything inside you can be filtered through diagnosis and protocol. Some things must be witnessed in their wild, raw, disordered state. You don't always need coping strategies. You need someone who isn't afraid to look at the fire without flinching. There's a cruelty in the way society labels the soul, a quiet violence in being told you're too much or not enough, when really you were just never seen correctly, not by your parents, not by your friends, sometimes not even by yourself. Psychology can teach you the patterns, but art lets you feel what the patterns never gave space for, and sometimes that's more honest than any treatment plan, because maybe you don't need to be analyzed, maybe you need to be seen. There are scenes you've seen 10 times, maybe 20, maybe more. You already know the lines, the music cue, the moment someone finally snaps, and still you return. But it's not nostalgia, it's ritual. You revisit those scenes the way some people revisit graves, because something inside you is buried there. And rewatching is not escape, it's rehearsal. It's the only place where your pain can unfold without consequence, where your body remembers something the world told you to forget. Freud called it repetition compulsion, the mind's silent ritual of revisiting trauma to gain mastery over it. But it's more than that. It's an emotional echo, a myth retold not for answers, but for dignity. In real life, your pain was ignored, minimized, distracted away. In fiction, it is framed, honored, given music, given light, given breath. You don't rewatch because you're stuck. You rewatch because part of you is still trying to finish the sentence you weren't allowed to say the first time. Tarantino gives you that sentence, frame by frame, not as therapy, but as mythology, as the theater of your wounds, turned into something you can finally observe without flinching. Because in the movie, you're not the victim anymore. You're the observer. And that distance, it heals in a way no explanation ever could. You don't watch movies, you revisit your personal mythology, frame by frame. There's a part of you that wants to destroy something, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A silent, burning need to rupture the mask you've been forced to wear. And when you see violence on screen, stylized, slow, explosive, it doesn't offend you. It speaks to you. Because it's not just blood, it's metaphor. It's the inner war made visible, the scream that finally found form. Tarantino doesn't glorify violence, he decodes it. He uses it to say what your mouth never could, that behind every shattered glass and every final shot, there's an invisible wound that was never allowed to speak. Carl Jung wrote of the archetypes we carry inside, the warrior, the destroyer. Forces that, when repressed, don't disappear. They rot, they twist, they implode, until one day they erupt. And suddenly you find yourself shouting, breaking, hurting, not knowing why, only knowing that silence had become a kind of death. Violence, in its symbolic form, is not about chaos. It's about awakening. There are parts of you that only come alive when something inside dies, when the mask is torn, when the performance collapses, when pretending is no longer sustainable. You watch that moment in film, the moment when a character crosses a line, and you feel something rise. Not because you want to imitate it, but because you recognize it. That's the honesty of it. Not that violence is the answer, but that sometimes it's the only thing loud enough to match the volume of your unspoken truth. In Tarantino's world, the violence is never just external, it's psychological, it's archetypal, and it reminds you your fire still exists, even if the world asked you to bury it. There's a moment in every Tarantino film when the characters start talking, not like actors following a script, but like people unraveling in real time. Sentences don't follow logic, humor hides fury, monologues spiral, double back, then break into silence. It's disjointed, chaotic, human, and you recognize it, because that's how your mind sounds. You don't think in clean lines, you think in loops, in contradictions, in memories that blur with metaphors. In rage you laugh through. In sadness you disguise as sarcasm. You try to explain yourself, but halfway through the words scatter, and all you're left with is the echo of what you couldn't say. Disorganized narrative, that's what they call it in trauma studies. The inability to tell your story from beginning to end, not because you forgot, but because the body still remembers too much, too fast, too loud. And memory, when it's too painful, doesn't file itself chronologically, it shatters. Tarantino doesn't clean that up. He doesn't force coherence. He lets his characters speak like fractured minds trying to stay afloat. The detours, the distractions, the sharp turns, they're not mistakes. They're maps of the inner labyrinth. And maybe that's why you never felt fully heard in therapy, because you were expected to translate your pain into sentences that made sense. But your pain was never linear. It was never polite. It was scattered, wounded, fragmented, real. And when you hear a character ramble about something absurd, only to suddenly crack open with a line that slices through the scene like a blade, you feel it. That's how your truth hides, under layers, behind performance, inside spirals. You don't speak in therapy because you don't know how to translate chaos into coherence, but Tarantino already speaks your dialect. And in a world obsessed with clarity, maybe that's the most honest voice of all. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. Most stories end with closure, with clarity, with the idea that healing means becoming someone new, someone whole, balanced, fixed. But your life hasn't followed that script. And maybe that's what hurts the most. The pressure to be finished, to transform your pain into something beautiful, to tie every scar into a lesson, to forgive what still feels like a wound. But Tarantino doesn't offer that kind of redemption. He doesn't clean the blood off the floor or force his characters into moral resolutions. Things stay broken, fractured, real. And somehow, that feels more honest than any happy ending ever could. Because what if healing isn't about perfection? What if it's about learning to live with what never got resolved, without hating yourself for it? Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that suffering is not the exception, it's the default. The human condition is not designed for constant peace. It's designed for depth, for consciousness, for becoming someone who can sit with the chaos and still breathe. Maybe you're not here to be flawless. Maybe you're here to survive in a way that makes the pain less shameful. You're not unfinished because you failed. You're unfinished because the story is still being written, not in chapters, but in silent mornings, unanswered messages, and the small victories no one sees. Redemption doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like waking up without self-hatred. Sometimes it looks like not needing to explain why you're still bleeding. You're not wrong for being unresolved. You're just real. There's a version of you that lives only in imagination. A version that doesn't flinch, doesn't hesitate, doesn't ask for permission. It's not about power. It's about release. About saying the thing you've swallowed 1,000 times. About doing what your shame always interrupted. And when you watch that character on screen, the one who crosses the line, who stops apologizing, who burns instead of shrinking. Something stirs, not envy, not fantasy, memory, because there was a moment, maybe many, when you wanted to snap too, not out of recklessness, but because silence had turned into suffocation, because swallowing your truth had started to taste like poison. Tarantino gives you that release, not to glorify destruction, but to remind you of something sacred. Your fire is not gone, just buried. Carl Jung spoke of the trickster, the chaotic force that disrupts order, that plays, that offends, that transforms. It's not evil. It's necessary, especially when the soul has been starved by politeness, by obedience, by fear. This is the archetype you feel rising when a character lashes out with poetic violence, when boundaries vanish, when consequences dissolve, and all that's left is raw, unscripted expression. But that character you admire isn't truly free. He's just what you'd be if you didn't keep swallowing your scream. And maybe that's the point. You don't need to become him. You don't need to explode. But you need to stop pretending the chaos isn't there. You need to know that under the numbness, you still burn. You're not as lost as you think. You're just censored. And your fire, even in silence, is still alive. It's not just cinema. It never was. It's exposure, a confrontation with something you've spent years trying to manage, contain, rationalize. The blood, the noise, the absurdity, none of it feels foreign. It feels like memory, not literal memory, but emotional memory. The kind that bypasses logic and goes straight to the place where your real self still lives. Because you're not watching a story unfold, you're remembering something about your own. That's why it stays with you, why the images linger, why the scenes don't just entertain. They echo, because deep down, you're not watching for distraction. You're watching for truth, and sometimes truth comes wrapped in chaos. Tarantino doesn't sanitize anything. He doesn't offer emotional safety. He offers recognition. He builds worlds where people bleed for the things you never dared to speak, where revenge isn't about cruelty, it's about finally being heard, where humor slices through despair like a scalpel, where characters don't transform, they survive. And sometimes that's enough. We live in a world obsessed with peace, but maybe peace is not what you've been craving. Maybe it's honesty, brutal, unfiltered, cinematic honesty. Because what's more terrifying than chaos is numbness, the quiet kind, the kind that creeps in when you've been pretending too long, the kind that convinces you that feeling nothing is safer than feeling too much. Tarantino rips that numbness open. He doesn't explain you. He shows what happens when the soul stops apologizing, when the shadow steps out from behind the curtain, when the masks fall, and what's left is raw, dissonant, unfinished humanity. And maybe that's why you come back. Not for answers, but for the reminder that underneath all your control, you are still real. There are wounds that don't want solutions, only space, only language, only someone who doesn't flinch when the fire starts speaking. Carl Jung believed that myth and art are not luxuries of the mind, they are necessities of the soul. They are how the unconscious reveals itself, how the shadow becomes image, how the inner war is made visible without shame. That's what Tarantino gives you. Not clarity, not healing, but shape, color, sound, movement, something ancient, primal, brutally human. And in a world obsessed with fixing, shaping, improving, maybe that's what you were missing. To be witnessed, not corrected. Pain doesn't always want to be resolved. Sometimes it just wants to be named, to exist outside your ribcage, to scream once without being silenced, to be grotesque without being hidden, to be real without being pathologized. Tarantino's worlds don't offer healing in the conventional sense, but they offer a mirror where your silence is loud, where your chaos is sacred, where your violence is not madness, but a memory trying to become language. Nietzsche once said, "Art is the proper task of life, not to beautify it, but to bear it, to carry the weight of what cannot be explained, only expressed." Because you weren't just watching films, You were decoding yourself through metaphor, through violence, through silence, through anti-heroes who failed with dignity, through endings that never resolved, through dialogue that mirrored your fragmented inner monologue, through moments that didn't teach you how to be better, but let you feel that being broken was never the enemy. You are not broken, just untranslated. And yes, there is still time to rewrite the script.